Chapter 8 of Bleak House. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Chapter 8. Covering a Multitude of Sins.
It was interesting, when I dressed before daylight, to peep out of window, where my candles were reflected in the black panes like two beacons, and finding all beyond still enshrouded in the indistinctness of last night, to watch how it turned out when the day came on. As the prospect gradually revealed itself and disclosed the scene over which the wind had wandered in the dark, like my memory over my life, I had a pleasure in discovering the unknown objects that had been around me in my sleep. At first they were faintly discernible in the mist, and above them the later stars still glimmered. That pale interval over, the picture began to enlarge and fill up so fast that at every new peep I could have found enough to look at for an hour. Imperceptibly my candles became the only incongruous part of the morning. The dark places in my room all melted away, and the day shone bright upon a cheerful landscape, prominent in which the old Abbey church, with its massive tower, threw a softer train of shadow on the view than seemed compatible with its rugged character. But so from rough outsides, I hope I have learnt, serene and gentle influences often proceed. Every part of the house was in such order, and every one was so attentive to me, that I had no trouble with my 2 bunches of keys, though what with trying to remember the contents of each little store-room drawer and cupboard, and what with making notes on a slate about jams and pickles and preserves and bottles and glass and china and a great many other things, and what with being generally a methodical, old-maidish sort of foolish little person, I was so busy that I could not believe it was breakfast time when I heard the bell ring. Away I ran, however, and made tea, as I had already been installed into the responsibility of the teapot. And then, as they were all rather late and nobody was down yet, I thought I would take a peep at the garden and get some knowledge of that too. I found it quite a delightful place. In front, the pretty avenue and drive by which we had approached, and where, by the by, we had cut up the gravel so terribly with our wheels that I asked the gardener to roll it. At the back, the flower garden, with my darling at her window up there, throwing it open to smile out at me as if she would have kissed me from that distance. Beyond the flower garden was a kitchen garden, and then a paddock, and then a snug little rickyard, and then a dear little farmyard. As to the house itself, with its 3 peaks in the roof, its various shaped windows, some so large, some so small, and all so pretty, its trellis work against the south front for roses and honeysuckle, and its homely, comfortable, welcoming look, it was, as Ada said when she came out to meet me with her arm through that of its master, worthy of her cousin John, a bold thing to say, though he only pinched her dear cheek for it. Mr. Skimpole was as agreeable at breakfast as he had been overnight. There was honey on the table, and it led him into a discourse about bees. He had no objection to honey, he said, and I should think he had not, for he seemed to like it, but he protested against the overweening assumptions of bees. He didn't at all see why the busy bee should be proposed as a model to him. He supposed the bee liked to make honey, or he wouldn't do it. Nobody asked him. It was not necessary for the bee to make such a merit of his tastes. If every confectioner went buzzing about the world, banging against everything that came in his way, and egotistically calling upon everybody to take notice that he was going to his work and must not be interrupted, the world would be quite an unsupportable place. Then, after all, it was a ridiculous position to be smoked out of your fortune with brimstone as soon as you had made it. You would have a very mean opinion of a Manchester man if he spun cotton for no other purpose. He must say he thought a drone the embodiment of a pleasanter and wiser idea. The drone said unaffectedly, "You will excuse me, I really cannot attend to the shop. I find myself in a world in which there is so much to see and so short a time to see it in that I must take the liberty of looking about me and begging to be provided for by somebody who doesn't want to look about him." This appeared to Mr. Skimpole to be the drone philosophy, and he thought it a very good philosophy, always supposing the drone to be willing to be on good terms with the bee, which, so far as he knew, the easy fellow always was, if the consequential creature would only let him and not be so conceited about his honey. He pursued this fancy with the lightest foot over a variety of ground and made us all merry, though again he seemed to have as serious a meaning in what he said as he was capable of having. I left them still listening to him when I withdrew to attend to my new duties. They had occupied me for some time, and I was passing through the passages on my return with my basket of keys on my arm when Mr. Jarndyce called me into a small room next his bedchamber, which I found to be in part a little library of books and papers, and in part quite a little museum of his boots and shoes and hat-boxes.
"Sit down, my dear," said Mr. Jarndyce. "This, you must know, is the growlery. When I am out of humour, I come and growl here."
"You must be here very seldom, sir," said I.
"Oh, you don't know me," he returned. "When I am deceived or disappointed in the wind, and it's easterly, I take refuge here. The growlery is the best used room in the house. You are not aware of half my humours yet. My dear, how you are trembling!"
I could not help it. I tried very hard, but being alone with that benevolent presence, and meeting his kind eyes, and feeling so happy and so honoured there, and my heart so full, I kissed his hand. I don't know what I said, or even that I spoke. He was disconcerted and walked to the window, I almost believed with an intention of jumping out, until he turned and I was reassured by seeing in his eyes what he had gone there to hide. He gently patted me on the head, and I sat down.
"There, there,"
he said.
"That's over. Pooh! Don't be foolish."
"It shall not happen again, sir," I returned. "But at first it is difficult."
"Nonsense,"
he said.
"It's easy, easy. Why not? I hear of a good little orphan girl without a protector, and I take it into my head to be that protector. She grows up and more than justifies my good opinion, and I remain her guardian and her friend. What is there in all this? So. Now, we have cleared off old scores, and I have before me thy pleasant, trusty face again."
I said to myself, "Esther, my dear, you surprise me. This really is not what I expected of you." And it had such a good effect that I folded my hands upon my basket and quite recovered myself. Mr. Jarndyce, expressing his approval in his face, began to talk to me as confidentially as if I had been in the habit of conversing with him every morning, for I don't know how long. I almost felt as if I had.
"Of course, Esther,"
he said,
"you don't understand this Chancery business."
And of course I shook my head.
"I don't know who does,"
he returned.
"The lawyers have twisted it into such a state of bedevilment that the original merits of the case have long disappeared from the face of the earth. It's about a will, and the trust's under a will, or it was once. It's about nothing but costs now. We are always appearing and disappearing, and swearing and interrogating, and filing and cross-filing, and arguing and sealing, and motioning and referring and reporting, and revolving about the Lord Chancellor and all his satellites, and equitably waltzing ourselves off to dusty death about costs. That's the great question. All the rest, by some extraordinary means, has melted away."
"But it was, sir," said I, to bring him back, for he began to rub his head, "about a will?"
"Why, yes, it was about a will, when it was about anything,"
he returned.
"A certain Jarndyce, in an evil hour, made a great fortune and made a great will. In the question how the trusts under that will are to be administered, the fortune left by the will is squandered away. The legatees under the will are reduced to such a miserable condition that they would be sufficiently punished if they had committed an enormous crime in having money left them, and the will itself is made a dead letter. All through the deplorable cause, everything that everybody in it, except one man, knows already, is referred to that only one man who don't know it to find out. All through the deplorable cause, everybody must have copies, over and over again, of everything that has accumulated about it in the way of cartloads of papers, or must pay for them without having them, which is the usual course, for nobody wants them, and must go down the middle and up again through such an infernal country dance of costs and fees and nonsense and corruption as was never dreamed of in the wildest visions of a witch's Sabbath. Equity sends questions to law. Law sends questions back to equity. Law finds it can't do this. Equity finds it can't do that. Neither can so much as say it can't do anything, without this solicitor instructing and this counsel appearing for A, and that solicitor instructing and that counsel appearing for B, and so on through the whole alphabet, like the history of the apple pie. And thus, through years and years and lives, everything goes on, constantly beginning over and over again, and nothing ever ends. And we can't get out of the suit on any terms, for we are made parties to it, and must be parties to it, whether we like it or not. But it won't do to think of it. When my great-uncle, poor Tom Jarndyce, began to think of it, it was the beginning of the end.
The Mr. Jarndyce, sir, whose story I have heard? He nodded gravely.
I was his heir, and this was his house, Esther. When I came here, it was bleak indeed. He had left the signs of his misery upon it.
How changed it must be now, I said.
It had been called before his time the Peaks. He gave it its present name and lived here shut up day and night, poring over the wicked heaps of papers in the suit and hoping against hope to disentangle it from its mystification and bring it to a close. In the meantime the place became dilapidated. The wind whistled through the cracked walls, the rain fell through the broken roof, the weeds choked the passage to the rotting door. When I brought what remained of him home here, the brains seemed to me to have been blown out of the house too, it was so shattered and ruined.
He walked a little to and fro after saying this to himself with a shudder, and then looked at me, and brightened, and came and sat down again with his hands in his pockets.
I told you this was the growlery, my dear. Where was I?
I reminded him at the hopeful change he had made in Bleak House.
Bleak House, true. There is in that city of London there some property of ours which is much at this day what Bleak House was then. I say property of ours, meaning of the suits, but I ought to call it the property of costs, for costs is the only power on earth that will ever get anything out of it now or will ever know it for anything but an eyesore and a heartsore. It is a street of perishing blind houses, with their eyes stoned out, without a pane of glass, without so much as a window frame, with the bare blank shutters trembling from their hinges and falling asunder, the iron rails peeling away in flakes of rust, the chimneys sinking in, the stone steps to every door, and every door might be death's door, turning stagnant green, the very crutches on which the ruins are propped decaying. Although Bleak House was not in Chancery, its master was, and it was stamped with the same seal. These are the Great Seal's impressions, my dear, all over England. The children know them.
How changed it is, I said again.
Why, so it is,
he answered much more cheerfully.
And it is wisdom in you to keep me to the bright side of the picture.
The idea of my wisdom!
These are things I never talk about or even think about, excepting in the growlery here. If you consider it right to mention them to Rick and Ada,
looking seriously at me,
You can. I leave it to your discretion, Esther."
"I hope, sir," said I.
"I think you had better call me guardian, my dear."
I felt that I was choking again. I taxed myself with it. "Esther, now you know you are." When he feigned to say this slightly, as if it were a whim instead of a thoughtful tenderness, but I gave the housekeeping keys the least shake in the world as a reminder to myself, and folding my hands in a still more determined manner on the basket, looked at him quietly. "I hope, guardian," said I, "that you may not trust too much to my discretion. I hope you may not mistake me. I am afraid it will be a disappointment to you to know that I am not clever, but it really is the truth, and you would soon find it out if I had not the honesty to confess it." He did not seem at all disappointed. Quite the contrary. He told me, with a smile all over his face, that he knew me very well indeed, and that I was quite clever enough for him. "I hope I may turn out so," said I, "but I am much afraid of it, guardian."
"You are clever enough to be the good little woman of our lives here, my dear," he returned playfully. "The little old woman of the child's, I don't mean Skimpole's, rhyme. Little old woman, and whither so high? To sweep the cobwebs out of the sky. You will sweep them so neatly out of our sky in the course of your housekeeping, Esther, that one of these days we shall have to abandon the growlery and nail up the door."
This was the beginning of my being called old woman, and little old woman, and cobweb, and Mrs. Shipton, and Mother Hubbard, and Dame Durden, and so many names of that sort that my own name soon became quite lost among them.
"However,"
said Mr. Jarndyce,
"to return to our gossip. Here's Rick, a fine young fellow full of promise. What's to be done with him?"
"Oh, my goodness! The idea of asking my advice on such a point!"
"Here he is, Esther,"
said Mr. Jarndyce, comfortably putting his hands into his pockets and stretching out his legs.
"He must have a profession. He must make some choice for himself. There will be a world more wiglomeration about it, I suppose, but it must be done."
"More what, guardian?" said I.
"More wiglomeration,"
said he.
"It's the only name I know for the thing. He is a ward in Chancery, my dear. Kenge and Carboy will have something to say about it. Master somebody. A sort of ridiculous sexton digging graves for the merits of causes in a back room at the end of Quality Court. Chancery Lane will have something to say about it. Council will have something to say about it. The Chancellor will have something to say about it. The satellites will have something to say about it. They will all have to be handsomely feed, all round, about it. The whole thing will be vastly ceremonious, wordy, unsatisfactory, and expensive, and I call it, in general, wiglomeration. How mankind ever came to be afflicted with wiglomeration, or for whose sins these young people ever fell into a pit of it, I don't know. So it is."
He began to rub his head again and to hint that he felt the wind. But it was a delightful instance of his kindness towards me that whether he rubbed his head or walked about or did both, his face was sure to recover its benignant expression as it looked at mine, and he was sure to turn comfortable again and put his hands in his pockets and stretch out his legs. "Perhaps it would be best, first of all," said I, "to ask Mr. Richard what he inclines to himself."
"Exactly so," he returned. "That's what I mean. You know, just accustom yourself to talk it over, with your tact and in your quiet way, with him and Ada, and see what you all make of it. We are sure to come at the heart of the matter by your means, little woman."
I was really frightened at the thought of the importance I was attaining and the number of things that were being confided to me. I had not meant this at all. I had meant that he should speak to Richard. But of course I said nothing in reply, except that I would do my best, though I feared, I really felt it necessary to repeat this, that he thought me much more sagacious than I was, at which my guardian only laughed the pleasantest laugh I ever heard.
"Come,"
he said, rising and pushing back his chair.
"I think we may have done with the growlery for one day. Only a concluding word, Esther, my dear. Do you wish to ask me anything?"
He looked so attentively at me that I looked attentively at him and felt sure I understood him. "About myself, sir?" said I.
"Yes."
"Guardian," said I, venturing to put my hand, which was suddenly colder than I could have wished, in his, "nothing. I am quite sure that if there were anything I ought to know, or had any need to know, I should not have to ask you to tell it to me. If my whole reliance and confidence were not placed in you, I must have a hard heart indeed. I have nothing to ask you, nothing in the world." He drew my hand through his arm, and we went away to look for Ada. From that hour I felt quite easy with him, quite unreserved, quite content to know no more, quite happy. We lived at first rather a busy life at Bleak House, for we had to become acquainted with many residents in and out of the neighbourhood who knew Mr. Jarndyce. It seemed to Ada and me that everybody knew him who wanted to do anything with anybody else's money. It amazed us when we began to sort his letters and to answer some of them for him in the growlery of a morning, to find how the great object of the lives of nearly all his correspondents appeared to be to form themselves into committees for getting in and laying out money. The ladies were as desperate as the gentlemen. Indeed, I think they were even more so. They threw themselves into committees in the most impassioned manner and collected subscriptions with a vehemence quite extraordinary. It appeared to us that some of them must pass their whole lives in dealing out subscription cards to the whole post-office directory, shilling cards, half-crown cards, half-sovereign cards, penny cards. They wanted everything. They wanted wearing apparel. They wanted linen rags. They wanted money. They wanted coals. They wanted soup. They wanted interest. They wanted autographs, they wanted flannel, they wanted whatever Mr. Jarndyce had, or had not. Their objects were as various as their demands. They were going to raise new buildings, they were going to pay off debts on old buildings, they were going to establish in a picturesque building, engraving of proposed west elevation attached, the sisterhood of mediaeval Marys. They were going to give a testimonial to Mrs. Jellyby. They were going to have their secretary's portrait painted and presented to his mother-in-law, whose deep devotion to him was well known. They were going to get up everything, I really believe, from 500,000 tracts to an annuity, and from a marble monument to a silver teapot. They took a multitude of titles. They were the women of England, the daughters of Britain, the sisters of all the cardinal virtues, separately, the females of America, the ladies of 100 denominations. They appeared to be always excited about canvassing and electing. They seemed, to our poor wits, and according to their own accounts, to be constantly polling people by tens of thousands, yet never bringing their candidates in for anything. It made our heads ache to think, on the whole, what feverish lives they must lead. Among the ladies who were most distinguished for this rapacious benevolence, if I may use the expression, was a Mrs. Pardiggle, who seemed, as I judge from the number of her letters to Mr. Jarndyce, to be almost as powerful a correspondent as Mrs. Jellyby herself. We observed that the wind always changed when Mrs. Pardiggle became the subject of conversation, and that it invariably interrupted Mr. Jarndyce and prevented his going any farther. When he had remarked that there were two classes of charitable people, one the people who did a little and made a great deal of noise, the other the people who did a great deal and made no noise at all. We were therefore curious to see Mrs. Pardiggle, suspecting her to be a type of the former class, and were glad when she called one day with her 5 young sons. She was a formidable style of lady with spectacles, a prominent nose, and a loud voice, who had the effect of wanting a great deal of room. And she really did, for she knocked down little chairs with her skirts that were quite a great way off. As only Ada and I were at home, we received her timidly, for she seemed to come in like cold weather and to make the little Pardiggles blue as they followed.
"These young ladies," said Mrs. Pardiggle with great volubility after the first salutations, "are my 5 boys. You may have seen their names in a printed subscription list, perhaps more than one, in the possession of our esteemed friend Mr. Jarndyce. Egbert, my eldest, 12, is the boy who sent out his pocket money to the amount of 5 and threepence to the Tockahoopo Indians. Oswald, my second, 10 and a half, is the child who contributed 2 and ninepence to the great National Smithers Testimonial. Francis, my third, 9, 1 and sixpence halfpenny. Felix, my fourth, 7, 8pence to the superannuated widows. Alfred, my youngest, 5, has voluntarily enrolled himself in the infant bonds of joy and is pledged never through life to use tobacco in any form."
We had never seen such dissatisfied children. It was not merely that they were weazened and shrivelled, though they were certainly that too, but they looked absolutely ferocious with discontent. At the mention of the Tockahoopo Indians, I could really have supposed Egbert to be one of the most baleful members of that tribe, he gave me such a savage frown. The face of each child, as the amount of his contribution was mentioned, darkened in a peculiarly vindictive manner, but his was by far the worst. I must except, however, the little recruit into the infant bonds of joy, who was stolidly and evenly miserable.
"You have been visiting, I understand,"
said Mrs. Pardiggle,
"at Mrs. Jellyby's."
We said yes, we had passed one night there.
"Mrs. Jellyby,"
pursued the lady, always speaking in the same demonstrative loud hard tone, so that her voice impressed my fancy as if it had a sort of spectacles on too. And I may take the opportunity of remarking that her spectacles were made the less engaging by her eyes, being what Ada called choking eyes, meaning very prominent.
"Mrs. Jellyby is a benefactor to society and deserves a helping hand. My boys have contributed to the African project, Egbert 1 and 6 being the entire allowance of 9 weeks. Oswald 1 and a penny halfpenny being the same, the rest according to their little means. Nevertheless, I do not go with Mrs. Jellyby in all things. I do not go with Mrs. Jellyby in her treatment of her young family. It has been noticed, it has been observed that her young family are excluded from participation in the objects to which she is devoted. She may be right, she may be wrong, but right or wrong, this is not my course with my young family. I take them everywhere." I was afterwards convinced, and so was Ada, that from the ill-conditioned eldest child these words extorted a sharp yell. He turned it off into a yawn, but it began as a yell. "They attend matins with me, very prettily done, at 6:30 in the morning, all the year round, including, of course, the depth of winter," said Mrs. Pardiggle rapidly, "and they are with me during the revolving duties of the day. I am a school lady, I am a visiting lady, I am a reading lady, I am a distributing lady, I am on the local linen box committee and many general committees, and my canvassing alone is very extensive, perhaps no one's more so. But they are my companions everywhere, and by these means they acquire that knowledge of the poor and that capacity of doing charitable business in general, in short, that taste for the sort of thing which will render them in after life a service to their neighbours and a satisfaction to themselves. My young family are not frivolous. They expend the entire amount of their allowance in subscriptions under my direction, and they have attended as many public meetings and listened to as many lectures, orations, and discussions as generally fall to the lot of few grown people. Alfred 5, who, as I mentioned, has of his own election joined the infant bonds of joy, was one of the very few children who manifested consciousness on that occasion after a fervid address of 2 hours from the chairman of the evening." Alfred glowered at us as if he never could or would forgive the injury of that night. "You may have observed, Miss Summerson," said Mrs. Pardiggle, "in some of the lists to which I have referred, in the possession of our esteemed friend Mr. Jarndyce, that the names of my young family are concluded with the name of O. A. Pardiggle, F.R.S., £1. That is their father. We usually observe the same routine. I put down my mite first, then my young family unroll their contributions according to their ages and their little means, and then Mr. Pardiggle brings up the rear. Mr. Pardiggle is happy to throw in his limited donation under my direction, and thus things are made not only pleasant to ourselves, but, we trust, improving to others." "Suppose,"
Mr. Pardiggle were to dine with Mr. Jellyby, and suppose Mr. Jellyby were to relieve his mind after dinner to Mr. Pardiggle, would Mr. Pardiggle, in return, make any confidential communication to Mr. Jellyby? I was quite confused to find myself thinking this, but it came into my head.
"You are very pleasantly situated here,"
said Mrs. Pardiggle. We were glad to change the subject, and going to the window, pointed out the beauties of the prospect, on which the spectacles appeared to me to rest with curious indifference.
"You know Mr. Gusher?"
said our visitor. We were obliged to say that we had not the pleasure of Mr. Gusher's acquaintance.
"The loss is yours, I assure you,"
said Mrs. Pardiggle with her commanding deportment.
"He is a very fervid, impassioned speaker, full of fire. Stationed in a waggon on this lawn now, which from the shape of the land is naturally adapted to a public meeting, he would improve almost any occasion you could mention for hours and hours. By this time, young ladies,"
said Mrs. Pardiggle, moving back to her chair and overturning, as if by invisible agency, a little round table at a considerable distance with my work-basket on it,
"by this time you have found me out, I dare say?"
This was really such a confusing question that Ada looked at me in perfect dismay. As to the guilty nature of my own consciousness after what I had been thinking, it must have been expressed in the colour of my cheeks.
"Found out, I mean," said Mrs. Pardiggle, "the prominent point in my character. I am aware that it is so prominent as to be discoverable immediately. I lay myself open to detection, I know. Well, I freely admit I am a woman of business. I love hard work. I enjoy hard work. The excitement does me good. I am so accustomed and inured to hard work that I don't know what fatigue is." We murmured that it was very astonishing and very gratifying, or something to that effect. I don't think we knew what it was either, but this is what our politeness expressed. "I do not understand what it is to be tired. You cannot tire me if you try," said Mrs. Pardiggle. "The quantity of exertion, which is no exertion to me, the amount of business, which I regard as nothing, that I go through sometimes astonishes myself. I have seen my young family and Mr. Pardiggle quite worn out with witnessing it, when I may truly say I have been as fresh as a lark."
If that dark-visaged eldest boy could look more malicious than he had already looked, this was the time when he did it. I observed that he doubled his right fist and delivered a secret blow into the crown of his cap, which was under his left arm.
"This gives me a great advantage when I am making my rounds," said Mrs. Pardiggle. "If I find a person unwilling to hear what I have to say, I tell that person directly, 'I am incapable of fatigue, my good friend. I am never tired, and I mean to go on until I have done.' It answers admirably. Miss Summerson, I hope I shall have your assistance in my visiting rounds immediately, and Miss Clare's very soon."
At first I tried to excuse myself for the present on the general ground of having occupations to attend to which I must not neglect. But as this was an ineffectual protest, I then said, more particularly, that I was not sure of my qualifications, that I was inexperienced in the art of adapting my mind to minds very differently situated and addressing them from suitable points of view, that I had not that delicate knowledge of the heart which must be essential to such a work, that I had much to learn myself before I could teach others, and that I could not confide in my good intentions alone. For these reasons I thought it best to be as useful as I could, and to render what kind services I could to those immediately about me, and to try to let that circle of duty gradually and naturally expand itself. All this I said with anything but confidence, because Mrs. Pardiggle was much older than I and had great experience, and was so very military in her manners.
"You are wrong, Miss Summerson," said she, "but perhaps you are not equal to hard work or the excitement of it, and that makes a vast difference. If you would like to see how I go through my work, I am now about, with my young family, to visit a brickmaker in the neighbourhood, a very bad character, and shall be glad to take you with me. Miss Clare also, if she will do me the favour."
Ada and I interchanged looks, and as we were going out in any case, accepted the offer. When we hastily returned from putting on our bonnets, we found the young family languishing in a corner and Mrs. Pardiggle sweeping about the room, knocking down nearly all the light objects it contained. Mrs. Pardiggle took possession of Ada, and I followed with the family. Ada told me afterwards that Mrs. Pardiggle talked in the same loud tone that indeed I overheard all the way to the brickmaker's about an exciting contest which she had for 2 or 3 years waged against another lady relative to the bringing in of their rival candidates for a pension somewhere. There had been a quantity of printing and promising and proxying and polling, and it appeared to have imparted great liveliness to all concerned, except the pensioners, who were not elected yet. I am very fond of being confided in by children, and am happy in being usually favoured in that respect, but on this occasion it gave me great uneasiness. As soon as we were out of doors, Egbert, with the manner of a little footpad, demanded a shilling of me, on the ground that his pocket-money was boned from him. On my pointing out the great impropriety of the word, especially in connexion with his parent, for he added sulkily, "by her," he pinched me and said, "Oh, then now, who are you? You wouldn't like it, I think. What does she make a sham for, and pretend to give me money and take it away again? Why do you call it my allowance and never let me spend it?" These exasperating questions so inflamed his mind and the minds of Oswald and Francis that they all pinched me at once, and in a dreadfully expert way, screwing up such little pieces of my arms that I could hardly forbear crying out. Felix at the same time stamped upon my toes, and the Bond of Joy, who on account of always having the whole of his little income anticipated, stood in fact pledged to abstain from cakes as well as tobacco, so swelled with grief and rage when we passed a pastry-cook's shop that he terrified me by becoming purple. I never underwent so much, both in body and mind, in the course of a walk with young people as from these unnaturally constrained children when they paid me the compliment of being natural. I was glad when we came to the brickmaker's house, though. It was one of a cluster of wretched hovels in a brick field, with pigsties close to the broken windows, and miserable little gardens before the doors, growing nothing but stagnant pools. Here and there an old tub was put to catch the droppings of rain-water from a roof, or they were banked up with mud into a little pond, like a large dirt pie. At the doors and windows some men and women lounged or prowled about, and took little notice of us except to laugh to one another, or to say something as we passed about gentlefolks minding their own business, and not troubling their heads and muddying their shoes with coming to look after other people's. Mrs. Pardiggle, leading the way with a great show of moral determination, and talking with much volubility about the untidy habits of the people, though I doubted if the best of us could have been tidy in such a place, conducted us into a cottage at the farthest corner, the ground-floor room of which we nearly filled. Besides ourselves, there were in this damp, offensive room a woman with a black eye nursing a poor little gasping baby by the fire, a man, all stained with clay and mud and looking very dissipated, lying at full length on the ground, smoking a pipe, a powerful young man fastening a collar on a dog, and a bold girl doing some kind of washing in very dirty water. They all looked up at us as we came in, and the woman seemed to turn her face towards the fire as if to hide her bruised eye. Nobody gave us any welcome. "Well, my friends," said Mrs. Pardiggle, but her voice had not a friendly sound, I thought. It was much too businesslike and systematic. "How do you do, all of you? I'm here again. I told you you couldn't tire me, you know. I am fond of hard work and am true to my word." "There aren't," growled the man on the floor, whose head rested on his hand as he stared at us, "any more on you to come in, is there?" "No, my friend," said Mrs. Pardiggle, seating herself on one stool and knocking down another. "We are all here." "Because I thought there warn't enough of you, perhaps," said the man, with his pipe between his lips, as he looked round upon us. The young man and the girl both laughed. Two friends of the young man, whom we had attracted to the doorway and who stood there with their hands in their pockets, echoed the laugh noisily. "You can't tire me, good people," said Mrs. Pardiggle to these latter. "I enjoy hard work, and the harder you make mine, the better I like it." "Then make it easy for her," growled the man upon the floor. "I wants it done and over.
I wants a end of these liberties took with my place. I wants an end of being drawed like a badger. Now, you're a-going to poll-pry and question according to custom. I know what you're a-going to be up to. Well, you haven't got no occasion to be up to it. I'll save you the trouble. Is my daughter a-washing? Yeah, she is a-washing. Look at the water. Smell it. That's what we drinks. How do you like it? And what do you think of gin instead? Ain't my place dirty? Yes, it is dirty. It's naturally dirty, and it's naturally unwholesome. And we've had 5 dirty and unwholesome children, as is all dead infants, and so much the better for them, and for us besides. Have I read the little book what you left? No, I ain't read the little book what you left. There ain't nobody here as knows how to read it, and if there was, it wouldn't be suitable to me. It's a book fit for a babby, and I'm not a babby. If you was to leave me a doll, I shouldn't nuss it. How have I been conducting of myself? Why, I've been drunk for 3 days, and I'd have been drunk 4 if I'd had the money. Don't I never mean for to go to church? No, I don't never mean for to go to church. I shouldn't be expected there if I did. The beadle's too genteel for me. And how did my wife get that black eye? Why, I give it her. And if she says I didn't, she's a lie.
He had pulled his pipe out of his mouth to say all this, and he now turned over on his other side and smoked again. Mrs. Pardiggle, who had been regarding him through her spectacles with a forcible composure, calculated, I could not help thinking, to increase his antagonism, pulled out a good book, as if it were a constable's staff, and took the whole family into custody. I mean into religious custody, of course, but she really did it as if she were an inexorable moral policeman, carrying them all off to a station-house. Ada and I were very uncomfortable. We both felt intrusive and out of place, and we both thought that Mrs. Pardiggle would have got on infinitely better if she had not had such a mechanical way of taking possession of people. The children sulked and stared. The family took no notice of us whatever, except when the young man made the dog bark, which he usually did when Mrs. Pardiggle was most emphatic. We both felt painfully sensible that between us and these people there was an iron barrier which could not be removed by our new friend. By whom or how it could be removed we did not know, but we knew that. Even what she read and said seemed to us to be ill chosen for such auditors, if it had been imparted ever so modestly and with ever so much tact. As to the little book to which the man on the floor had referred, we acquired a knowledge of it afterwards, and Mr. Jarndyce said he doubted if Robinson Crusoe could have read it, though he had had no other on his desolate island. We were very much relieved under these circumstances when Mrs. Pardiggle left off. The man on the floor, then turning his head round again, said morosely, "Well, you've done, have you?"
"For to-day I have, my friend, but I am never fatigued. I shall come to you again in your regular order," returned Mrs. Pardiggle with demonstrative cheerfulness.
"So long as you goes now,"
said he, folding his arms and shutting his eyes with an oath,
"you may do what you like."
Mrs. Pardiggle accordingly rose and made a little vortex in the confined room from which the pipe itself very narrowly escaped. Taking one of her young family in each hand and telling the others to follow closely, and expressing her hope that the brickmaker and all his house would be improved when she saw them next, she then proceeded to another cottage. I hope it is not unkind in me to say that she certainly did make, in this as in everything else, a show that was not conciliatory of doing charity by wholesale and of dealing in it to a large extent. She supposed that we were following her, but as soon as the space was left clear, we approached the woman sitting by the fire to ask if the baby were ill. She only looked at it as it lay on her lap. We had observed before that when she looked at it, she covered her discoloured eye with her hand, as though she wished to separate any association with noise and violence and ill treatment from the poor little child. Ada, whose gentle heart was moved by its appearance, bent down to touch its little face. As she did so, I saw what happened and drew her back. The child died.
"Oh, Esther!"
cried Ada, sinking on her knees beside it.
Look here. Oh, Esther, my love, the little thing, the suffering, quiet, pretty little thing. I'm so sorry for it. I'm so sorry for the mother. I never saw a sight so pitiful as this before. Oh, baby, baby!"
Such compassion, such gentleness as that with which she bent down weeping and put her hand upon the mother's, might have softened any mother's heart that ever beat. The woman at first gazed at her in astonishment, and then burst into tears. Presently I took the light burden from her lap, did what I could to make the baby's rest the prettier and gentler, laid it on a shelf, and covered it with my own handkerchief. We tried to comfort the mother, and we whispered to her what our Saviour said of children. She answered nothing, but sat weeping, weeping very much. When I turned, I found that the young man had taken out the dog and was standing at the door looking in upon us with dry eyes, but quiet. The girl was quiet too, and sat in a corner looking on the ground. The man had risen. He still smoked his pipe with an air of defiance, but he was silent. An ugly woman, very poorly clothed, hurried in while I was glancing at them, and coming straight up to the mother, said, "Jenny, Jenny!" The mother rose on being so addressed, and fell upon the woman's neck. She also had upon her face and arms the marks of ill usage. She had no kind of grace about her, but the grace of sympathy. But when she condoled with the woman, and her own tears fell, she wanted no beauty. I say condoled, but her only words were, "Jenny, Jenny." All the rest was in the tone in which she said them. I thought it very touching to see these two women, coarse and shabby and beaten, so united, to see what they could be to one another, to see how they felt for one another, how the heart of each to each was softened by the hard trials of their lives. I think the best side of such people is almost hidden from us. What the poor are to the poor is little known, excepting to themselves and God. We felt it better to withdraw and leave them uninterrupted. We stole out quietly and without notice from any one except the man. He was leaning against the wall near the door, and finding that there was scarcely room for us to pass, went out before us. He seemed to want to hide that he did this on our account, but we perceived that he did, and thanked him. He made no answer. Ada was so full of grief all the way home, and Richard, whom we found at home, was so distressed to see her in tears, though he said to me when she was not present how beautiful it was too, that we arranged to return at night with some little comforts and repeat our visit at the brickmaker's house. We said as little as we could to Mr. Jarndyce, but the wind changed directly. Richard accompanied us at night to the scene of our morning expedition. On our way there we had to pass a noisy drinking-house where a number of men were flocking about the door. Among them, and prominent in some dispute, was the father of the little child. At a short distance we passed the young man and the dog in congenial company. The sister was standing laughing and talking with some other young women at the corner of the row of cottages, but she seemed ashamed and turned away as we went by. We left our escort within sight of the brickmaker's dwelling and proceeded by ourselves. When we came to the door, we found the woman who had brought such consolation with her standing there looking anxiously out. "Is it you, young ladies, is it?" she said in a whisper. "I'm a-watching for my master. My heart's in my mouth. If he was to catch me away from home, he'd pretty near murder me." "Do you mean your husband?" said I. "Yes, miss, my master. Jenny's asleep, quite worn out. She scarcely had the child off her lap, poor thing, these 7 days and nights, except when I've been able to take it for a minute or two." As she gave way for us, she went softly in and put what we had brought near the miserable bed on which the mother slept. No effort had been made to clean the room. It seemed in its nature almost hopeless of being clean, but the small waxen form from which so much solemnity diffused itself had been composed afresh, and washed, and neatly dressed in some fragments of white linen, and on my handkerchief, which still covered the poor baby, a little bunch of sweet herbs had been laid by the same rough, scarred hands, so lightly, so tenderly. "May heaven reward you," we said to her. "You are a good woman."
"Me, young ladies?"
she returned with surprise.
"Hush, Jenny, Jenny!"
The mother had moaned in her sleep and moved. The sound of the familiar voice seemed to calm her again. She was quiet once more. How little I thought, when I raised my handkerchief to look upon the tiny sleeper underneath, and seemed to see a halo shine around the child through Ada's drooping hair as her pity bent her head, how little I thought in whose unquiet bosom that handkerchief would come to lie after covering the motionless and peaceful breast. I only thought that perhaps the angel of the child might not be all unconscious of the woman who replaced it with so compassionate a hand, not all unconscious of her presently when we had taken leave, and left her at the door, by turns looking and listening in terror for herself, and saying in her old soothing manner, "Jenny, Jenny!" End of chapter 8. Of Bleak House. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Chapter 9. Signs and Tokens. I don't know how it is I seem to be always writing about myself. I mean all the time to write about other people, and I try to think about myself as little as possible. And I am sure when I find myself coming into the story again, I am really vexed and say, "Dear, dear, you tiresome little creature, I wish you wouldn't." But it is all of no use. I hope any one who may read what I write will understand that if these pages contain a great deal about me, I can only suppose it must be because I have really something to do with them and can't be kept out. My darling and I read together and worked and practised and found so much employment for our time that the winter days flew by us like bright-winged birds. Generally in the afternoons and always in the evenings Richard gave us his company. Although he was one of the most restless creatures in the world, he certainly was very fond of our society. He was very, very, very fond of Ada. I mean it, and I had better say it at once. I had never seen any young people falling in love before, but I found them out quite soon. I could not say so, of course, or show that I knew anything about it. On the contrary, I was so demure and used to seem so unconscious that sometimes I considered within myself while I was sitting at work whether I was not growing quite deceitful. But there was no help for it. All I had to do was to be quiet, and I was as quiet as a mouse. They were as quiet as mice too, so far as any words were concerned, but the innocent manner in which they relied more and more upon me as they took more and more to one another was so charming that I had great difficulty in not showing how it interested me. "Our dear little old woman is such a capital old woman," Richard would say, coming up to meet me in the garden early with his pleasant laugh and perhaps the least tinge of a blush, "that I can't get on without her. Before I begin my harum-scarum day, grinding away at those books and instruments and then galloping up hill and down dale, all the country round, like a highwayman,
It does me so much good to come and have a steady walk with our comfortable friend that here I am again."
You know, Dame Durden dear, Ada would say at night, with her head upon my shoulder and the firelight shining in her thoughtful eyes, "I don't want to talk when we come upstairs here, only to sit a little while thinking, with your dear face for company, and to hear the wind and remember the poor sailors at sea." Ah, perhaps Richard was going to be a sailor. We had talked it over very often now, and there was some talk of gratifying the inclination of his childhood for the sea. Mr. Jarndyce had written to a relation of the family, a great Sir Leicester Dedlock, for his interest in Richard's favour generally, and Sir Leicester had replied in a gracious manner that he would be happy to advance the prospects of the young gentleman if it should ever prove to be within his power, which was not at all probable, and that my Lady sent her compliments to the young gentleman, to whom she perfectly remembered that she was allied by a remote consanguinity, and trusted that he would ever do his duty in any honourable profession to which he might devote himself.
"So I apprehend it's pretty clear,"
said Richard to me,
"that I shall have to work my own way. Never mind. Plenty of people have had to do that before now, and have done it. I only wish I had the command of a clipping privateer to begin with, and could carry off the Chancellor and keep him on short allowance until he gave judgment in our cause. He'd find himself growing thin if he didn't look sharp." With a buoyancy and hopefulness and a gaiety that hardly ever flagged, Richard had a carelessness in his character that quite perplexed me, principally because he mistook it in such a very odd way for prudence. It entered into all his calculations about money in a singular manner which I don't think I can better explain than by reverting for a moment to our loan to Mr. Skimpole. Mr. Jarndyce had ascertained the amount, either from Mr. Skimpole himself or from Coavinses, and had placed the money in my hands with instructions to me to retain my own part of it and hand the rest to Richard. The number of little acts of thoughtless expenditure which Richard justified by the recovery of his £10, and the number of times he talked to me as if he had saved or realized that amount, would form a sum in simple addition. "My prudent Mother Hubbard, why not?"
he said to me when he wanted, without the least consideration, to bestow £5 on the brickmaker.
"I made £10 clear out of Coavinses' business."
"How was that?" said I.
"Why, I got rid of £10, which I was quite content to get rid of, and never expected to see any more. You don't deny that?"
"No," said I.
"Very well. Then I came into possession of £10."
"The same £10?" I hinted.
"That has nothing to do with it,"
returned Richard.
"I have got £10 more than I expected to have, and consequently I can afford to spend it without being particular."
In exactly the same way, when he was persuaded out of the sacrifice of these £5 by being convinced that it would do no good, he carried that sum to his credit and drew upon it.
"Let me see,"
he would say.
"I saved £5 out of the brickmaker's affair, so if I have a good rattle to London and back in a post-chaise and put that down at £4, I shall have saved one. And it's a very good thing to save one, let me tell you. A penny saved is a penny got." I believe Richard's was as frank and generous a nature as there possibly can be. He was ardent and brave, and in the midst of all his wild restlessness was so gentle that I knew him like a brother in a few weeks. His gentleness was natural to him and would have shown itself abundantly even without Ada's influence, but with it he became one of the most winning of companions, always so ready to be interested and always so happy, sanguine, and light-hearted. I am sure that I, sitting with them and walking with them and talking with them and noticing from day to day how they went on, falling deeper and deeper in love and saying nothing about it, and each shyly thinking that this love was the greatest of secrets, perhaps not yet suspected even by the other, I am sure that I was scarcely less enchanted than they were, and scarcely less pleased with the pretty dream.
We were going on in this way when one morning at breakfast Mr. Jarndyce received a letter, and looking at the superscription said,
"From Boythorn."
"Aye, aye," and opened and read it with evident pleasure, announcing to us in a parenthesis, when he was about half-way through, that Boythorn was coming down on a visit. Now, who was Boythorn, we all thought. And I dare say we all thought, too, I am sure I did for one, would Boythorn at all interfere with what was going forward?
"I went to school with this fellow, Lawrence Boythorn,"
said Mr. Jarndyce, tapping the letter as he laid it on the table,
"more than 45 years ago. He was then the most impetuous boy in the world, and he is now the most impetuous man. He was then the loudest boy in the world, and he is now the loudest man. He was then the heartiest and sturdiest boy in the world, and he is now the heartiest and sturdiest man. He is a tremendous fellow."
"In stature, sir?" asked Richard.
"Pretty well, Rick, in that respect,"
said Mr. Jarndyce.
"Being some 10 years older than I, and a couple of inches taller, with his head thrown back like an old soldier, his stalwart chest squared, his hands like a clean blacksmith's, and his lungs, there's no simile for his lungs, talking, laughing, or snoring, they make the beams of the house shake."
As Mr. Jarndyce sat enjoying the image of his friend Boythorn, we observed the favourable omen that there was not the least indication of any change in the wind.
"But it's the inside of the man, the warm heart of the man, the passion of the man, the fresh blood of the man, Rick, and Ada, and little Cobweb too, for you are all interested in a visitor that I speak of,"
he pursued.
"His language is as sounding as his voice. He is always in extremes, perpetually in the superlative degree. In his condemnation he is all ferocity. You might suppose him to be an ogre from what he says, and I believe he has the reputation of one with some people. There, I tell you no more of him beforehand. You must not be surprised to see him take me under his protection, for he has never forgotten that I was a low boy at school, and that our friendship began in his knocking 2 of my head tyrant's teeth out, he says 6, before breakfast. Boythorn and his man,"
to me,
"will be here this afternoon, my dear."
I took care that the necessary preparations were made for Mr. Boythorn's reception, and we looked forward to his arrival with some curiosity. The afternoon wore away, however, and he did not appear. The dinner hour arrived, and still he did not appear. The dinner was put back an hour, and we were sitting round the fire with no light but the blaze, when the hall door suddenly burst open, and the hall resounded with these words, uttered with the greatest vehemence and in a stentorian tone:
"We have been misdirected, Jarndyce, by a most abandoned ruffian who told us to take the turning to the right instead of to the left. He is the most intolerable scoundrel on the face of the earth. His father must have been a most consummate villain. Ever to have such a son! I would have had that fellow shot without the least remorse."
"Did he do it on purpose?" Mr. Jarndyce inquired.
"I have not the slightest doubt that the scoundrel has passed his whole existence in misdirecting travellers,"
returned the other.
"By my soul, I thought him the worst-looking dog I had ever beheld when he was telling me to take the turning to the right, and yet I stood before that fellow face to face and didn't knock his brains out." "Teeth, you mean?"
said Mr. Jarndyce. Laughed Mr. Lawrence Boythorn, really making the whole house vibrate.
"What, have you not forgotten it yet?" "And that was another most consummate vagabond. By my soul, the countenance of that fellow when he was a boy was the blackest image of
perfidy, cowardice, and cruelty ever set up as a scarecrow in a field of scoundrels. If I were to meet that most unparalleled despot in the streets to-morrow, I would fell him like a rotten tree."
"I have no doubt of it," said Mr. Jarndyce. "Now, will you come upstairs?"
"By my soul, Jarndyce," returned his guest, who seemed to refer to his watch, "if you had been married, I would have turned back at the garden gate and gone away to the remotest summits of the Himalaya mountains sooner than I would have presented myself at this unseasonable hour."
"Not quite so far, I hope?" said Mr. Jarndyce.
"By my life and honour, yes!"
cried the visitor.
"I wouldn't be guilty of the audacious insolence of keeping a lady of the house waiting all this time for any earthly consideration. I would infinitely rather destroy myself, infinitely rather."
Talking thus, they went upstairs, and presently we heard him in his bedroom thundering and again until the flattest echo in the neighbourhood seemed to catch the contagion and to laugh as enjoyingly as he did, or as we did, when we heard him laugh. We all conceived a prepossession in his favour, for there was a sterling quality in his laugh, and in his vigorous healthy voice, and in the roundness and fullness with which he uttered every word he spoke, and in the very fury of his superlatives, which seemed to go off like blank cannons and hurt nothing. But we were hardly prepared to have it so confirmed by his appearance when Mr. Jarndyce presented him. He was not only a very handsome old gentleman, upright and stalwart as he had been described to us, with a massive grey head, a fine composure of face when silent, a figure that might have become corpulent but for his being so continually in earnest that he gave it no rest, and a chin that might have subsided into a double chin but for the vehement emphasis in which it was constantly required to assist. But he was such a true gentleman in his manner, so chivalrously polite. His face was lighted by a smile of so much sweetness and tenderness, and it seemed so plain that he had nothing to hide, but showed himself exactly as he was, incapable, as Richard said, of anything on a limited scale, and firing away with those blank great guns because he carried no small arms whatever, that really I could not help looking at him with equal pleasure as he sat at dinner, whether he smilingly conversed with Ada and me, or was led by Mr. Jarndyce into some great volley of superlatives, or threw up his head like a bloodhound and gave out that tremendous
"You have brought your bird with you, I suppose?"
said Mr. Jarndyce.
"By heaven, he is the most astonishing bird in Europe," replied the other. "He is the most wonderful creature. I wouldn't take 10,000 guineas for that bird. I have left an annuity for his sole support in case he should outlive me. He is in sense and attachment a phenomenon, and his father before him was one of the most astonishing birds that ever lived."
The subject of this laudation was a very little canary, who was so tame that he was brought down by Mr. Boythorn's man on his forefinger, and after taking a gentle flight round the room, alighted on his master's head. To hear Mr. Boythorn presently expressing the most implacable and passionate sentiments, with this fragile mite of a creature quietly perched on his forehead, was to have a good illustration of his character, I thought.
"By my soul, Jarndyce,"
he said, very gently holding up a bit of bread to the canary to peck at,
"if I were in your place, I would seize every master in Chancery by the throat to-morrow morning and shake him until his money rolled out of his pockets and his bones rattled in his skin. I would have a settlement out of somebody, by fair means or by foul. If you would empower me to do it, I would do it for you with the greatest satisfaction."
All this time the very small canary was eating out of his hand.
"I thank you, Lawrence, but the suit is hardly at such a point at present,"
returned Mr. Jarndyce, laughing,
"that it would be greatly advanced even by the legal process of shaking the bench and the whole bar."
"There never was such an infernal cauldron as that Chancery on the face of the earth,"
said Mr. Boythorn.
"Nothing but a mine below it on a busy day in term time, with all its records, rules, and precedents collected in it, and every functionary belonging to it also, high and low, upward and downward, from its son, the accountant general, to its father, the devil, and the whole blown to atoms with 10,000 hundredweight of gunpowder, would reform it in the least."
It was impossible not to laugh at the energetic gravity with which he recommended this strong measure of reform. When we laughed, he threw up his head and shook his broad chest, and again the whole country seemed to echo to his It had not the least effect in disturbing the bird, whose sense of security was complete, and who hopped about the table with its quick head now on this side and now on that, turning its bright sudden eye on its master as if he were no more than another bird.
"But how do you and your neighbour get on about the disputed right of way?"
said Mr. Jarndyce.
"You are not free from the toils of the law yourself."
"The fellow has brought actions against me for trespass, and I have brought actions against him for trespass,"
returned Mr. Boythorn.
"By heaven, he is the proudest fellow breathing. It is morally impossible that his name can be Sir Leicester. It must be Sir Lucifer."
"Complimentary to our distant relation,"
said my guardian laughingly to Ada and Richard.
"I would beg Miss Clare's pardon and Mr. Carstone's pardon,"
resumed our visitor,
"if I were not reassured by seeing in the fair face of the lady and the smile of the gentleman that it is quite unnecessary, and that they keep their distant relation at a comfortable distance."
"Or he keeps us," suggested Richard.
"By my soul!"
exclaimed Mr. Boythorn, suddenly firing another volley.
"That fellow is, and his father was, and his grandfather was, the most stiff-necked, arrogant, imbecile, pig-headed numbskull ever, by some inexplicable mistake of nature, born in any station of life but a walking-stick's. The whole of that family are the most solemnly conceited and consummate blockheads. But it's no matter. He should not shut up my path if he were 50 baronets melted into one, and living in 100 Chesney wolds, one within another, like the ivory balls in a Chinese carving. The fellow, by his agent or secretary or somebody, writes to me, 'Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, presents his compliments to Mr. Lawrence Boythorn, and has to call his attention to the fact that the green pathway by the old parsonage house, now the property of Mr. Lawrence Boythorn, is Sir Leicester's right of way, being in fact a portion of the park of Chesney Wold, and that Sir Leicester finds it convenient to close up the same.' I write to the fellow, 'Mr. Lawrence Boythorn presents his compliments to Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet,' and has to call his attention to the fact that he totally denies the whole of Sir Leicester Dedlock's positions on every possible subject, and has to add, in reference to closing up the pathway, that he will be glad to see the man who may undertake to do it. The fellow sends a most abandoned villain with one eye to construct a gateway. I play upon that execrable scoundrel with a fire-engine until the breath is nearly driven out of his body. The fellow erects a gate in the night. I chop it down and burn it in the morning. He sends his myrmidons to come over the fence and pass and repass. I catch them in humane man-traps, fire split peas at their legs, play upon them with the engine, resolve to free mankind from the insupportable burden of the existence of those lurking ruffians. He brings actions for trespass. I bring actions for trespass. He brings actions for assault and battery. I defend them and continue to assault and batter.
To hear him say all this with unimaginable energy, one might have thought him the angriest of mankind. To see him at the very same time looking at the bird now perched upon his thumb and softly smoothing its feathers with his forefinger, one might have thought him the gentlest. To hear him laugh and see the broad good nature of his face then, one might have supposed that he had not a care in the world, or a dispute, or a dislike, but that his whole existence was a summer joke.
"No, no," he said, "no closing up of my paths by any Dedlock, though I willingly confess,"
here he softened in a moment,
"that Lady Dedlock is the most accomplished lady in the world, to whom I would do any homage that a plain gentleman, and no baronet with a head 700 years thick, may.
A man who joined his regiment at 20, and within a week challenged the most imperious and presumptuous coxcomb of a commanding officer that ever drew the breath of life through a tight waist, and got broke for it, is not the man to be walked over by all the Sir Lucifers, dead or alive, locked or unlocked."
"Nor the man to allow his junior to be walked over either,"
said my guardian.
"Most assuredly not,"
said Mr. Boythorn, clapping him on the shoulder with an air of protection that had something serious in it, though he laughed.
"He will stand by the low boy always, Jarndyce. You may rely upon him. But speaking of this trespass, with apologies to Miss Clare and Miss Summerson for the length at which I have pursued so dry a subject, is there nothing for me from your men Kenge and Carboy?"
"I think not, Esther,"
said Mr. Jarndyce. "Nothing, guardian."
"Much obliged,"
said Mr. Boythorn.
"Had no need to ask, after even my slight experience of Miss Summerson's forethought for every one about her."
"They all encouraged me. They were determined to do it."
"I inquired because, coming from Lincolnshire, I, of course, have not yet been in town, and I thought some letters might have been sent down here. I dare say they will report progress to-morrow morning."
I saw him so often in the course of the evening, which passed very pleasantly, contemplate Richard and Ada with an interest and a satisfaction that made his fine face remarkably agreeable, as he sat at a little distance from the piano, listening to the music. And he had small occasion to tell us that he was passionately fond of music, for his face showed it, that I asked my guardian, as we sat at the backgammon board, whether Mr. Boythorn had ever been married.
"No,"
said he.
"No."
"But he meant to be," said I.
"How did you find out that?"
he returned with a smile. "Why, guardian," I explained, not without reddening a little at hazarding what was in my thoughts, "there is something so tender in his manner after all, and he is so very courtly and gentle to us, and—" Mr. Jarndyce directed his eyes to where he was sitting, as I have just described him. I said no more.
"You are right, little woman,"
he answered.
"He was all but married once, long ago, and once."
"Did the lady die?"
"No, but she died to him. That time has had its influence on all his later life. Would you suppose him to have a head and a heart full of romance yet?"
"I think, guardian, I might have supposed so, but it is easy to say that when you have told me so."
"He has never since been what he might have been,"
said Mr. Jarndyce.
"And now you see him in his age, with no one near him but his servant and his little yellow friend. It's your throw, my dear."
I felt, from my guardian's manner, that beyond this point I could not pursue the subject without changing the wind. I therefore forbore to ask any further questions. I was interested, but not curious. I thought a little while about this old love story in the night, when I was awakened by Mr. Boythorn's lusty snoring, and I tried to do that very difficult thing, imagine old people young again and invested with the graces of youth, but I fell asleep before I had succeeded, and dreamed of the days when I lived in my godmother's house. I am not sufficiently acquainted with such subjects to know whether it is at all remarkable that I almost always dreamed of that period of my life. With the morning there came a letter from Messrs. Kenge and Carboy to Mr. Boythorn, informing him that one of their clerks would wait upon him at noon. As it was the day of the week on which I paid the bills and added up my books and made all the household affairs as compact as possible, I remained at home while Mr. Jarndyce, Ada, and Richard took advantage of a very fine day to make a little excursion. Mr. Boythorn was to wait for Kenge and Carboy's clerk, and then was to go on foot to meet them on their return. Well, I was full of business, examining tradesmen's books, adding up columns, paying money, filing receipts, and I dare say making a great bustle about it, when Mr. Guppy was announced and shown in. I had had some idea that the clerk who was to be sent down might be the young gentleman who had met me at the coach-office, and I was glad to see him, because he was associated with my present happiness. I scarcely knew him again, he was so uncommonly smart. He had an entirely new suit of glossy clothes on, a shining hat, lilac kid gloves, a neckerchief of a variety of colours, a large hothouse flower in his buttonhole, and a thick gold ring on his little finger. Besides which, he quite scented the dining-room with bear's grease and other perfumery. He looked at me with an attention that quite confused me when I begged him to take a seat until the servant should return, and as he sat there crossing and uncrossing his legs in a corner, and I asked him if he had had a pleasant ride and hoped that Mr. Kenge was well, I never looked at him, but I found him looking at me in the same scrutinizing and curious way. When the request was brought to him that he would go upstairs to Mr. Boythorn's room, I mentioned that he would find lunch prepared for him when he came down, of which Mr. Jarndyce hoped he would partake. He said with some embarrassment, holding the handle of the door, "Shall I have the honour of finding you here, miss?" I replied yes, I should be there, and he went out with a bow and another look. I thought him only awkward and shy, for he was evidently much embarrassed, and I fancied that the best thing I could do would be to wait until I saw that he had everything he wanted and then to leave him to himself. The lunch was soon brought, but it remained for some time on the table. The interview with Mr. Boythorn was a long one, and a stormy one too, I should think, for although his room was at some distance, I heard his loud voice rising every now and then like a high wind, and evidently blowing perfect broadsides of denunciation. At last Mr. Guppy came back, looking something the worse for the conference. "My eye, miss," he said in a low voice, "he's a Tartar." "Pray take some refreshment, sir," said I. Mr. Guppy sat down at the table and began nervously sharpening the carving-knife on the carving-fork, still looking at me, as I felt quite sure without looking at him, in the same unusual manner. The sharpening lasted so long that at last I felt a kind of obligation on me to raise my eyes in order that I might break the spell under which he seemed to labour, of not being able to leave off. He immediately looked at the dish and began to carve.
"What will you take yourself, miss? You'll have a morsel of something?"
"No, thank you," said I.
"Shan't I give you a piece of anything at all, miss?"
said Mr. Guppy, hurriedly drinking off a glass of wine. "Nothing, thank you," said I. "I have only waited to see that you have everything you want. Is there anything I can order for you?"
"No, I'm much obliged to you, miss, I'm sure. I've everything that I can require to make me comfortable. At least not comfortable. I'm never that." He drank off 2 more glasses of wine, one after another. I thought I had better go. "I beg your pardon, miss," said Mr. Guppy, rising when he saw me rise, "but would you allow me the favour of a minute's private conversation?" Not knowing what to say, I sat down again. "What follows is without prejudice, miss," said Mr. Guppy, anxiously bringing a chair towards my table. "I don't understand what you mean," said I, wondering. "It's one of our law terms, miss. You won't make any use of it to my detriment at Kenge and Carboy's or elsewhere. If our conversation shouldn't lead to anything, I am to be as I was, and am not to be prejudiced in my situation or worldly prospects. In short, it's in total confidence."
"I am at a loss, sir," said I, "to imagine what you can have to communicate in total confidence to me, whom you have never seen but once, but I should be very sorry to do you any injury."
"Thank you, miss. I'm sure of it. That's quite sufficient."
All this time Mr. Guppy was either planing his forehead with his handkerchief or tightly rubbing the palm of his left hand with the palm of his right.
"If you would excuse my taking another glass of wine, miss, I think it might assist me in getting on without a continual choke that cannot fail to be mutually unpleasant."
He did so and came back again. I took the opportunity of moving well behind my table.
"You wouldn't allow me to offer you one, would you, miss?"
said Mr. Guppy, apparently refreshed. "Not any," said I.
"Not half a glass?"
said Mr. Guppy.
"Quarter? No? Then, to proceed. My present salary, Miss Summerson, at Kenge and Carboy's, is £2 a week. When I first had the happiness of looking upon you, it was £1.15, and had stood at that figure for a lengthened period. A rise of 5 has since taken place, and a further rise of 5 is guaranteed at the expiration of a term not exceeding 12 months from the present date. My mother has a little property, which takes the form of a small life annuity, upon which she lives in an independent though unassuming manner in the Old Street Road. She is eminently calculated for a mother-in-law. She never interferes, is all for peace, and her disposition easy. She has her failings, as who has not, but I never knew her do it when company was present, at which time you may freely trust her with wines, spirits, or malt liquors. My own abode is lodgings at Penton Place, Pentonville. It is lowly, but airy, open at the back, and considered one of the healthiest outlets. Miss Summerson, in the mildest language, I adore you. Would you be so kind as to allow me, as I may say, to file a declaration, to make an offer?" Mr. Guppy went down on his knees. I was well behind my table and not much frightened. I said, "Get up from that ridiculous position immediately, sir, or you will oblige me to break my implied promise and ring the bell." "Hear me out, miss,"
said Mr. Guppy, folding his hands. "I cannot consent to hear another word, sir," I returned, "unless you get up from the carpet directly and go and sit down at the table as you ought to do if you have any sense at all." He looked piteously, but slowly rose and did so.
"Yet what a mockery it is, miss,"
he said with his hand upon his heart and shaking his head at me in a melancholy manner over the tray,
"to be stationed behind food at such a moment. The soul recoils from food at such a moment, miss."
"I beg you to conclude," said I. "You have asked me to hear you out, and I beg you to conclude."
"I will, miss," said
Mr. Guppy.
"As I love and honour, so likewise I obey. Would that I could make thee the subject of that vow before the shrine."
"That is quite impossible," said I, "and entirely out of the question."
"I am aware,"
said Mr. Guppy, leaning forward over the tray and regarding me, as I again strangely felt, though my eyes were not directed to him, with his late intent look,
"I am aware that in a worldly point of view, according to all appearances, my offer is a poor one. But, Miss Summerson, angel, no, don't ring. I have been brought up in a sharp school and am accustomed to a variety of general practice. Though a young man, I have ferreted out evidence, got up cases, and seen lots of life. Blessed with your hand, what means might I not find of advancing your interests and pushing your fortunes?"
"What might I not get to know nearly concerning you? I know nothing now, certainly, but what might I not if I had your confidence and you set me on?" I told him that he addressed my interest, or what he supposed to be my interest, quite as unsuccessfully as he addressed my inclination, and he would now understand that I requested him, if he pleased, to go away immediately.
"Cruel miss,"
said Mr. Guppy.
Here, but another word. I think you must have seen that I was struck with those charms on the day when I waited at the waiter cellar. I think you must have remarked that I could not forbear a tribute to those charms when I put up the steps of the hackney coach. It was a feeble tribute to thee, but it was well meant. Thy image has ever since been fixed in my breast. I have walked up and down of an evening opposite Jellyby's house, only to look upon the bricks that once contained thee. This out of to-day, quite an unnecessary out so far as the attendance, which was its pretended object, went, was planned by me alone, for thee alone. If I speak of interest, it is only to recommend myself and my respectful wretchedness. Love was before it, and is before it.
I should be pained, Mr. Guppy, said I, rising and putting my hand upon the bell-rope, to do you or any one who is sincere the injustice of slighting any honest feeling, however disagreeably expressed. If you have really meant to give me a proof of your good opinion, though ill-timed and misplaced, I feel that I ought to thank you. I have very little reason to be proud, and I am not proud, I hope. I think I added, without very well knowing what I said, that you will now go away as if you had never been so exceedingly foolish and attend to Messrs. Kenge and Carboy's business.
Half a minute, miss,
cried Mr. Guppy, checking me as I was about to ring.
This has been without prejudice.
I will never mention it, said I, unless you should give me future occasion to do so.
A quarter of a minute, miss, in case you should think better at any time, however distant. That's no consequence, for my feelings can never alter. Of anything I have said, particularly what might I not do, Mr. William Guppy, 87, Penton Place, or if removed, or dead, of blighted hopes or anything of that sort, care of Mrs. Guppy, 302 Old Street Road, will be sufficient.
I rang the bell, the servant came, and Mr. Guppy, laying his written card upon the table and making a dejected bow, departed. Raising my eyes as he went out, I once more saw him looking at me after he had passed the door. I sat there for another hour or more, finishing my books and payments and getting through plenty of business. Then I arranged my desk and put everything away, and was so composed and cheerful that I thought I had quite dismissed this unexpected incident. But when I went upstairs to my own room, I surprised myself by beginning to laugh about it, and then surprised myself still more by beginning to cry about it. In short, I was in a flutter for a little while, and felt as if an old chord had been more coarsely touched than it ever had been since the days of the dear old doll, long buried in the garden.
End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Bleak House. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Chapter 10. The Law Writer. On the eastern borders of Chancery Lane, that is to say, more particularly in Cook's Court, Cursitor Street, Mr. Snagsby, law stationer, pursues his lawful calling. In the shade of Cook's Court, at most times a shady place, Mr. Snagsby has dealt in all sorts of blank forms of legal process, in skins and rolls of parchment, in paper, foolscap, brief, draft, brown, white, whitey brown, and blotting, in stamps, in office quills, pens, ink, india-rubber, pounce, pins, pencils, sealing-wax, and wafers, in red tape and green ferret, in pocket-books, almanacs, diaries, and law lists, in string-boxes, rulers, inkstands, glass and leaden, pen-knives, scissors, bodkins, and other small office cutlery. In short, in articles too numerous to mention, ever since he was out of his time and went into partnership with Peffer. On that occasion, Cook's Court was in a manner revolutionized by the new inscription in fresh paint, Peffer and Snagsby, displacing the time-honoured and not easily to be deciphered legend Peffer only. For smoke, which is the London ivy, had so wreathed itself round Peffer's name and clung to his dwelling-place that the affectionate parasite quite overpowered the parent tree. Peffer is never seen in Cook's Court now. He is not expected there, for he has been recumbent this quarter of a century in the churchyard of St. Andrew's, Holborn, with the waggons and hackney coaches roaring past him all the day and half the night like one great dragon. If he ever steal forth, when the dragon is at rest, to air himself again in Cook's Court, until admonished to return by the crowing of the sanguine cock in the cellar at the little dairy in Cursitor Street, whose ideas of daylight it would be curious to ascertain, since he knows from his personal observation next to nothing about it. If Peffer ever do revisit the pale glimpses of Cook's Court, which no law-stationer in the trade can positively deny, he comes invisibly, and no one is the worse or wiser. In his lifetime, and likewise in the period of Snagsby's time, of 7 long years, there dwelt with Peffer in the same law-stationering premises a niece, a short, shrewd niece, something too violently compressed about the waist, and with a sharp nose like a sharp autumn evening, inclining to be frosty towards the end. The Cook's courtiers had a rumour flying among them that the mother of this niece did, in her daughter's childhood, moved by too jealous a solicitude that her figure should approach perfection, lace her up every morning with her maternal foot against the bedpost for a stronger hold and purchase, and further that she exhibited internally pints of vinegar and lemon juice, which acids they held had mounted to the nose and temper of the patient. With whichsoever of the many tongues of rumour this frothy report originated, it either never reached or never influenced the ears of young Snagsby, who, having wooed and won its fair subject on his arrival at man's estate, entered into 2 partnerships at once. So now, in Cook's Court, Cursitor Street, Mr. Snagsby and the niece are one, and the niece still cherishes her figure, which, however tastes may differ, is unquestionably so far precious that there is mighty little of it. Mr. and Mrs. Snagsby are not only one bone and one flesh, but, to the neighbours' thinking, one voice too. That voice, appearing to proceed from Mrs. Snagsby alone, is heard in Cook's Court very often. Mr. Snagsby, otherwise than as he finds expression through these dulcet tones, is rarely heard. He is a mild, bald, timid man with a shining head and a scrubby clump of black hair sticking out at the back. He tends to meekness and obesity. As he stands at his door in Cook's Court, in his grey shop-coat and black calico sleeves, looking up at the clouds, or stands behind a desk in his dark shop with a heavy flat ruler, snipping and slicing at sheepskin in company with his 2 prentices, he is emphatically a retiring and unassuming man. From beneath his feet, at such times, as from a shrill ghost unquiet in its grave, there frequently arise complainings and lamentations in the voice already mentioned, and haply on some occasions, when these reach a sharper pitch than usual, Mr. Snagsby mentions to the prentices, "I think my little woman is a-giving it to Guster." This proper name, so used by Mr. Snagsby, has before now sharpened the wit of the Cook's courtiers to remark that it ought to be the name of Mrs. Snagsby, seeing that she might, with great force and expression, be termed a Guster in compliment to her stormy character. It is, however, the possession, and the only possession, except 50 shillings per annum and a very small box indifferently filled with clothing, of a lean young woman from a workhouse, by some supposed to have been christened Augusta, who, although she was farmed or contracted for during her growing time by an amiable benefactor of his species resident at Tooting, and cannot fail to have been developed under the most favourable circumstances, has fits, which the parish can't account for. Guster, really aged 3 or 4 and 20, but looking a round 10 years older, goes cheap with this unaccountable drawback of fits, and is so apprehensive of being returned on the hands of her patron saint that except when she is found with her head in the pail, or the sink, or the copper, or the dinner, or anything else that happens to be near her at the time of her seizure, she is always at work. She is a satisfaction to the parents and guardians of the prentices, who feel that there is little danger of her inspiring tender emotions in the breast of youth. She is a satisfaction to Mrs. Snagsby, who can always find fault with her. She is a satisfaction to Mr. Snagsby, who thinks it a charity to keep her. The law-stationer's establishment is, in Guster's eyes, a temple of plenty and splendour. She believes the little drawing-room upstairs, always kept, as one may say, with its hair in papers and its pinafore on, to be the most elegant apartment in Christendom. The view it commands of Cook's Court at one end, not to mention a squint into Cursitor Street, and of Coavinses, the sheriff's officer's backyard, at the other, she regards as a prospect of unequalled beauty. The portraits it displays in oil, and plenty of it too, of Mr. Snagsby looking at Mrs. Snagsby, and of Mrs. Snagsby looking at Mr. Snagsby, are in her eyes as achievements of Raphael or Titian. Guster has some recompenses for her many privations. Mr. Snagsby refers everything not in the practical mysteries of the business to Mrs. Snagsby. She manages the money, reproaches the tax-gatherers, appoints the times and places of devotion on Sundays, licenses Mr. Snagsby's entertainments, and acknowledges no responsibility as to what she thinks fit to provide for dinner, insomuch that she is the high standard of comparison among the neighbouring wives a long way down Chancery Lane on both sides, and even out in Holborn, who in any domestic passages of arms habitually call upon their husbands to look at the difference between their, the wives', position and Mrs. Snagsby's, and their, the husband's, behaviour and Mr. Snagsby's. Rumour, always flying bat-like about Cook's Court and skimming in and out at everybody's windows, does say that Mrs. Snagsby is jealous and inquisitive, and that Mr. Snagsby is sometimes worried out of house and home, and that if he had the spirit of a mouse he wouldn't stand it. It is even observed that the wives who quote him to their self-willed husbands as a shining example in reality look down upon him, and that nobody does so with greater superciliousness than one particular lady whose lord is more than suspected of laying his umbrella on her as an instrument of correction. But these vague whisperings may arise from Mr. Snagsby's being in his way rather a meditative and poetical man, loving to walk in Staple Inn in the summer-time, and to observe how countrified the sparrows and the leaves are, also to lounge about the Rolls Yard of a Sunday afternoon, and to remark, if in good spirits, that there were old times once, and that you'd find a stone coffin or two now under that chapel, he'll be bound, if you was to dig for it. He solaces his imagination, too, by thinking of the many chancellors and vices and masters of the rolls who are deceased, and he gets such a flavour of the country out of telling the two 'prentices how he HAS heard say that a brook as clear as crystal once ran right down the middle of Holborn, when turnstile really was a turnstile, leading slap away into the meadows, gets such a flavour of the country out of this that he never wants to go there. The day is closing in, and the gas is lighted, but is not yet fully effective, for it is not quite dark. Mr. Snagsby, standing at his shop door, looking up at the clouds, sees a crow, who is out late, skim westward over the slice of sky belonging to Cook's Court. The crow flies straight across Chancery Lane and Lincoln's Inn Garden into Lincoln's Inn Fields. Here, in a large house, formerly a house of state, lives Mr. Tulkinghorn. It is let off in sets of chambers now, and in those shrunken fragments of its greatness lawyers lie like maggots in nuts. But its roomy staircases, passages, and antechambers still remain, and even its painted ceilings, where allegory, in Roman helmet and celestial linen, sprawls among balustrades and pillars, flowers, clouds, and big-legged boys, and makes the head ache, as would seem to be allegory's object always, more or less. Here among his many boxes labelled with transcendent names lives Mr. Tulkinghorn, when not speechlessly at home in country houses where the great ones of the earth are bored to death. Here he is to-day, quiet at his table, an oyster of the old school whom nobody can open. Like as he is to look at, so is his apartment in the dusk of the present afternoon. Rusty, out of date, withdrawing from attention, able to afford it. Heavy, broad-backed, old-fashioned mahogany and horsehair chairs, not easily lifted. Obsolete tables with spindle legs and dusty baize covers, presentation prints of the holders of great titles in the last generation or the last but one, environ him. A thick and dingy Turkey carpet muffles the floor where he sits, attended by 2 candles in old-fashioned silver candlesticks that give a very insufficient light to his large room. The titles on the backs of his books have retired into the binding. Everything that can have a lock has got one. No key is visible. Very few loose papers are about. He has some manuscript near him, but is not referring to it. With the round top of an inkstand and 2 broken bits of sealing-wax, he is silently and slowly working out whatever train of indecision is in his mind. Now the inkstand top is in the middle, now the red bit of sealing-wax, now the black bit. That's not it. Mr. Tulkinghorn must gather them all up and begin again. Here, beneath the painted ceiling, with foreshortened allegory staring down at his intrusion as if it meant to swoop upon him, and he cutting it dead, Mr. Tulkinghorn has at once his house and office. He keeps no staff, only one middle-aged man, usually a little out at elbows, who sits in a high pew in the hall and is rarely overburdened with business. Mr. Tulkinghorn is not in a common way. He wants no clerks. He is a great reservoir of confidences, not to be so tapped. His clients want him. He is all in all. Drafts that he requires to be drawn are drawn by special pleaders in the Temple on mysterious instructions. Fair copies that he requires to be made are made at the stationer's, expense being no consideration. The middle-aged man in the pew knows scarcely more of the affairs of the peerage than any crossing sweeper in Holborn. The red bit, the black bit, the inkstand top, the other inkstand top, the little sandbox. So, you to the middle, you to the right, you to the left. This train of indecision must surely be worked out now or never. Now. Mr. Tulkinghorn gets up, adjusts his spectacles, puts on his hat, puts the manuscript in his pocket, goes out, tells the middle-aged man out at elbows, "I shall be back presently." Very rarely tells him anything more explicit. Mr. Tulkinghorn goes, as the crow came, not quite so straight, but nearly, to Cook's Court, Cursitor Street, to Snagsby's, law stationers, deeds engrossed and copied, law writing executed in all its branches, etc., etc., etc. It is somewhere about 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and a balmy fragrance of warm tea hovers in Cook's Court. It hovers about Snagsby's door. The hours are early there, dinner at 1:30 and supper at 9:30. Mr. Snagsby was about to descend into the subterranean regions to take tea when he looked out of his door just now and saw the crow, who was out late. "Master at home?" Guster is minding the shop, for the 'prentices take tea in the kitchen with Mr. and Mrs. Snagsby. Consequently, the robe-maker's 2 daughters, combing their curls at the 2 glasses in the 2 second-floor windows of the opposite house, are not driving the 2 'prentices to distraction, as they fondly suppose, but are merely awakening the unprofitable admiration of Guster, whose hair won't grow, and never would, and it is confidently thought never will. "Master at home?" says Mr. Tulkinghorn. Master is at home, and Guster will fetch him. Guster disappears, glad to get out of the shop, which he regards with mingled dread and veneration as a storehouse of awful implements of the great torture of the law, a place not to be entered after the gas is turned off. Mr. Snagsby appears, greasy, warm, herbaceous, and chewing, bolts a bit of bread and butter, and says, "Bless my soul, sir, Mr. Tulkinghorn." "I want half a word with you, Snagsby." "Certainly, sir. Dear me, sir, why didn't you send your young man round for me? Pray walk into the back shop, sir." Snagsby has brightened in a moment. The confined room, strong of parchment grease, is warehouse, counting-house, and copying-office. Mr. Tulkinghorn sits, facing round, on a stool at the desk. "Jarndyce and Jarndyce, Snagsby?" "Yes, sir." Mr. Snagsby turns up the gas and coughs behind his hand, modestly anticipating profit. Mr. Snagsby, as a timid man, is accustomed to cough with a variety of expressions and so to save words. "You copied some affidavits in that cause for me lately?" "Yes, sir, we did." "There was one of them," says Mr. Tulkinghorn, carelessly feeling tight, unopenable oyster of the old school, in the wrong pocket. "The handwriting of which is peculiar, and I rather like. As I happened to be passing, and thought I had it about me, I looked in to ask you, but I haven't got it. No matter. Any other time will do. Ah, here it is. I looked in to ask you who copied this."
"Who copied this, sir?"
says Mr. Snagsby, taking it, laying it flat on the desk, and separating all the sheets at once with a twirl and a twist of the left hand, peculiar to law-stationers.
"We gave this out, sir. We were giving out rather a large quantity of work just at that time. I can tell you in a moment who copied it, sir, by referring to my book."
Mr. Snagsby takes his book down from the safe, makes another bolt of the bit of bread and butter, which seemed to have stopped short, eyes the affidavit aside, and brings his right forefinger travelling down a page of the book.
"Juby, Packer, Jarndyce. Jarndyce. Here we are, sir,"
says Mr. Snagsby.
"To be sure, I might have remembered. This was given out, sir, to a writer who lodges just over on the opposite side of the lane."
Mr. Tulkinghorn has seen the entry, found it before the law-stationer, read it while the forefinger was coming down the hill. "What do you call him? Nemo?" says Mr. Tulkinghorn.
"Nemo, sir. Here it is. 42 folio. Given out on the Wednesday night at 8 o'clock. Brought in on the Thursday morning at 9:30.
"Nemo," repeats Mr. Tulkinghorn. "Nemo is Latin for no one."
"It must be English for someone, sir, I think."
Mr. Snagsby submits with his deferential cough.
It is a person's name. Here it is, you see, sir. 42 folio. Given out Wednesday night, 8 o'clock. Brought in Thursday morning, 9:30.
The tail of Mr. Snagsby's eye becomes conscious of the head of Mrs. Snagsby looking in at the shop door to know what he means by deserting his tea. Mr. Snagsby addresses an explanatory cough to Mrs. Snagsby, as who should say, "My dear, a customer."
9:30, sir,"
repeats Mr. Snagsby.
Law writers who live by job work are a queer lot, and this may not be his name, but it's the name he goes by. I remember now, sir, that he gives it in a written advertisement he sticks up down at the Rule Office and the King's Bench Office and the Judges' Chambers and so forth. You know the kind of document, sir. Wanting employ.
Mr. Tulkinghorn glances through the little window at the back of Coavinses, the sheriff's officers, where lights shine in Coavinses' windows. Coavinses' coffee-room is at the back, and the shadows of several gentlemen under a cloud loom cloudily upon the blinds. Mr. Snagsby takes the opportunity of slightly turning his head to glance over his shoulder at his little woman and to make apologetic motions with his mouth to this effect, "Tulkinghorn rich influential." "Have you given this man work before?" asks Mr. Tulkinghorn.
Oh dear, yes, sir. Work of yours."
"Thinking of more important matters, I forget where you said he lived."
"Across the lane, sir. In fact, he lodges at a—"
Mr. Snagsby makes another bolt, as if the bit of bread and butter were insurmountable.
"At a rag and bottle shop."
"Can you show me the place as I go back?"
With the greatest of pleasure, sir."
Mr. Snagsby pulls off his sleeves and his grey coat, pulls on his black coat, takes his hat from its peg.
Here is my little woman,"
he says aloud.
"My dear, will you be so kind as to tell one of the lads to look after the shop while I step across the lane with Mr. Tulkinghorn? Mrs. Snagsby, sir. I shan't be 2 minutes, my love."
Mrs. Snagsby bends to the lawyer, retires behind the counter, peeps at them through the window-blind, goes softly into the back office, refers to the entries in the book still lying open, is evidently curious.
"You will find the place is rough, sir,"
says Mr. Snagsby, walking deferentially in the road and leaving the narrow pavement to the lawyer.
"And the party is very rough. But they're a wild lot in general, sir. The advantage of this particular man is that he never wants sleep. He'll go at it right on end if you want him to, as long as ever you like."
It is quite dark now, and the gas lamps have acquired their full effect. Jostling against clerks going to post the day's letters, and against counsel and attorneys going home to dinner, and against plaintiffs and defendants and suitors of all sorts, and against the general crowd, in whose way the forensic wisdom of ages has interposed 1,000,000 of obstacles to the transaction of the commonest business of life. Diving through law and equity, and through that kindred mystery, the street mud, which is made of nobody knows what, and collects about us nobody knows whence or how, we only knowing in general that when there is too much of it we find it necessary to shovel it away. The lawyer and the law stationer come to a rag and bottle shop and general emporium of much disregarded merchandise, lying and being in the shadow of the wall of Lincoln's Inn, and kept, as is announced in paint to all whom it may concern, by one Krook.
"This is where he lives, sir,"
says the law stationer. "This is where he lives, is it?" says the lawyer unconcernedly. "Thank you."
"Are you not going in, sir?"
"No, thank you, no. I'm going on to the fields at present. Good evening. Thank you."
Mr. Snagsby lifts his hat and returns to his little woman and his tea.
But Mr. Tulkinghorn does not go on to the fields at present. He goes a short way, turns back, comes again to the shop of Mr. Krook, and enters it straight. It is dim enough, with a blot-headed candle or so in the windows, and an old man and a cat sitting in the back part by a fire. The old man rises and comes forward with another blot-headed candle in his hand. "Pray, is your lodger within?"
"Male or female, sir?"
says Mr. Krook. "Male. The person who does copying." Mr. Krook has eyed his man narrowly, knows him by sight, has an indistinct impression of his aristocratic repute.
"Did you wish to see him, sir?"
"Yes."
"It's what I seldom do myself," says Mr. Krook with a grin. "Shall I call him down? But it's a weak chance if he comes, sir."
"I'll go up to him, then," says Mr. Tulkinghorn.
"Second floor, sir. Take the candle. Up there."
Mr. Krook, with his cat beside him, stands at the bottom of the staircase, looking after Mr. Tulkinghorn.
"Hi, hi!"
he says when Mr. Tulkinghorn has nearly disappeared. The lawyer looks down over the handrail. The cat expands her wicked mouth and snarls at him.
"Order, Lady Jane. Behave yourself to visitors, my lady. You know what they say of my lodger?"
whispers Krook, going up a step or two. "What do they say of him?"
"They say he has sold himself to the enemy, but you and I know better. He don't buy. I'll tell you what, though, my lodger is so black-humoured and gloomy that I believe he'd as soon make that bargain as any other. Don't put him out, sir. That's my advice."
Mr. Tulkinghorn, with a nod, goes on his way. He comes to the dark door on the second floor. He knocks, receives no answer, opens it, and accidentally extinguishes his candle in doing so. The air of the room is almost bad enough to have extinguished it if he had not. It is a small room, nearly black with soot and grease and dirt. In the rusty skeleton of a grate, pinched at the middle as if poverty had gripped it, a red coke fire burns low. In the corner by the chimney stand a deal table and a broken desk, a wilderness marked with a rain of ink. In another corner, a ragged old portmanteau on one of the two chairs serves for cabinet or wardrobe. No larger one is needed, for it collapses like the cheeks of a starved man. The floor is bare, except that one old mat, trodden to shreds of rope yarn, lies perishing upon the hearth. No curtain veils the darkness of the night, but the discoloured shutters are drawn together, and through the two gaunt holes pierced in them, famine might be staring in, the banshee of the man upon the bed. For on a low bed opposite the fire, a confusion of dirty patchwork, lean-ribbed ticking, and coarse sacking, the lawyer, hesitating just within the doorway, sees a man. He lies there, dressed in shirt and trousers, with bare feet. He has a yellow look, and the spectral darkness of a candle that has guttered down until the whole length of its wick, still burning, has doubled over and left a tower of winding-sheet about it. His hair is ragged, mingling with his whiskers and his beard, the latter ragged too and grown, like the scum and mist around him in neglect. Foul and filthy as the room is, foul and filthy as the air is, it is not easy to perceive what fumes those are which most oppress the senses in it, but through the general sickliness and faintness and the odour of stale tobacco there comes into the lawyer's mouth the bitter, vapid taste of opium. "Hallo, my friend!" he cries, and strikes his iron candlestick against the door. He thinks he has awakened his friend. He lies a little turned away, but his eyes are surely open. "Hallo, my friend!" he cries again. "Hallo! Hallo!" As he rattles on the door, the candle which has drooped so long goes out and leaves him in the dark, with the gaunt eyes and the shutters staring down upon the bed. End of chapter 10.